12.4, completing the square. So what we're going to learn is we're going to learn how to solve for x, okay? Now, what you need to know about completing the square is we are going to be solving perfect square problems. Now, what that means is if I were to give you the problem, like let's say x squared plus 10x plus 25, and I said to factor that, you would find the factors of 25 and know that it's going to be x plus 5 times x plus 5. This is called a perfect square because it's the exact same thing in parentheses. So if I wanted to, I could write it like this, okay? It has the exact same things. It is a perfect square. So we're trying to solve for problems once they are in this, we're trying to solve for x once the problems are in a form like this, x plus 4 or x plus 5 squared equals whatever may be over there. But the problem is it's not going to automatically be in that form. I've got to put it in that form. And there's the formula called completing the square, okay? Now it looks really hard and intimidating and scary, but it's really not, okay? Because it's used a lot of letters instead of numbers. So that's why I wrote this problem right down here. So we can kind of, as we're explaining it, work through it. So take a second, write this down. All right, let me walk through this formula right up here for a second with you, and then we'll apply it to the problem right underneath it. First of all, this will always be given to you, x squared plus bx. You always want that, okay? For instance, this would be considered x squared plus bx. B is always the number in front of x, always. So b would be considered 10 in this problem right below it. Now, what we are going to do, okay, is I am trying to get a third term to add into the problem because I always want there to be 3 terms in the problem because I've got to get a perfect square. I've got to factor it, okay? So that's what that b divided by 2 squared is. Now this x on the other side isn't the same as these x's on the left side. That x just represents a random number that will be in your equation. There should always be a number on the other side. Always, okay? The other thing is x squared plus bx always has to be on one side by itself. There can be nothing else with it whenever we start the problem. So as long as that's on one side by itself, we can go ahead and continue. Where we are going to get this third term from is all I'm going to do is I'm going to take b, which in this case is 10, and I'm going to divide it by 2. Well, what's 10 divided by 2? 5. And then I'm just going to square that. What's 5 squared? 25. So that's where that third term comes in. So now I have 10x plus 25. Whatever I do to one side, I've got to do to the other. So if I add 25 here, I've got to add 25 here. And then I'm just going to do my perfect square now. I'll tell you a very easy way to do it, okay? All you're going to do is we need to write parentheses because remember a perfect square is going to be x plus or minus whatever we have. This is always how you find it. X is always going to be here. The sign that I use is always going to be the sign in front of b. So is it going to be x plus or x minus? X plus. And then in order to find the third term, all I do is I take the square root of that term that we just added in. What's the square root of 25? 5. Equals, what's 24 plus 25? Now it's in my perfect square problem, and I've got to solve for x. Okay? Now, yesterday when we were solving radical expressions, remember, if there was a square root, we squared it to get rid of that square root. Whatever we did to one side, we did to the other. But what happens now if it's squared? How do I get rid of the squared? What's the opposite? The radical sign, the square root. That will cancel that out. Whatever I do to one side, I got to do to the other. So now I have x plus 5 is equal to, what's the square root of 49? What kind of 7? Positive and negative. There's 2 answers. So that means I've got to split this problem in order to solve for x into 2 different problems. Because x plus 5 is equal to positive 7, but x plus 5 is also equal to negative 7. That's all we do to solve. So we just subtract 5 on both sides. 7 minus 5 is 2. Subtract 5 on both sides. Negative 7 plus negative 5 is negative 12. That's how you find your 2 answers when you're completing the square. In example number 1, they want us to do complete the square. First of all, the first thing that I have got to know before I do this is x squared and bx on one side by itself? Yes, there's nothing else over there. So I'm good to go. I can start my process. Now remember, we're trying to add in a third term right here between the 2x and the equals. And I've got to come up with that third term. And the formula that you use is b divided by 2 squared. So I'm going to say x squared plus 2x plus, what is b? 2 divided by 2 and then squared. Now last time we just did it in our head. This is the actual formula that you would use if you were to work it out on paper. Now, whatever I did on one side, I've got to do to the other. So 2 divided by 2 squared. What's 2 divided by 2? 1. What's 1 squared? 1. So I've got x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 35 plus 1. Because I know whatever the one side equaled has to do the other. Now it's time to do our perfect square. So we do our parentheses. I know there's always going to be an x up front. What is the term, or what's it going to be, positive or negative? Positive. And then all you do is take this third term that we just inserted in and do the square root. What's the square root of 1? 1. Equals, what's 35 plus 1? 36. Don't forget about it has to be squared, so it should be x plus 1 squared. Because that's what the perfect square is. It means x plus 1 times x plus 1. Now, how would I solve this? What would I do now? Square root. Cancels that out. But whatever I do to one side, I got to do to the other. So now what am I left with? X plus 1 equals, what's the square root of 36? Positive negative 6. So that means I'm going to have 2 problems. Because I've got x plus 1 equals 6. And x plus 1 equals negative 6. Subtract 1 on both sides. X is equal to 5. Subtract 1 on both sides. X is equal to negative 7. Alright, so the next problem on this page is x squared plus 16x equals 4. First of all, what do I need to make sure of? How do I know if I can start this problem or not? If the x squared and the bx are on one side by themselves, are they? Yes, so I'm good to go. I can start it. So I've got to add in that third term. And how am I going to do that? What do I do? 16 over 2 and then square it. Because it's b, which is 16, divided by 2 squared. Then whatever I do to one side, I've got to do to the other. What's 16 divided by 2? 8. What's 8 squared? Okay. Now, I've got to do the perfect square of this problem. So I do, x is always going to be my first term. What's going to be my sign, positive or negative? Positive. And what's going to be my third term? 8. How did you know that it was 8? because it's the square root of 64. 4 plus 64 is 68. Now, what do I do once I get to this step? Square root, and I get x plus 8 is equal to, what's the square root of 68? There isn't one. Can I simplify the square root of 68? Yes, I can. So I need to do upside down division. 2, 34, 2, 17. So I have a pair of 2's, which mean I'm going to write a 2 on the outside and the square root of 17. What should be in front of that 2 times the square root of 17? Positive, negative. Now, here's the difference between this problem and the one that we've done before. There is no exact answer to 2 times the square root of 17. So I'm not going to break it into problems to solve, because if I subtract 8, am I going to be able to subtract 8 from this term right here? No, because they're not like terms. So it's pointless for me to break it into 2 problems, because I'm not going to be able to go any farther. So I can just write this as one problem that counts as 2 answers. I'm going to have negative 8 plus and minus 2 times the square root of 17. Because this sign right here, plus and minus, tells me that I'm going to have 2 different answers. But I can't work it any farther. So I'm just going to write it one time, save myself a little bit of time. Okay, now look at these problems. What is that first step that you have to ask yourself? Is there anything on the same side of x squared plus bx? Yes. So guess what I've got to do? I've got to move it to the other side. You say, but wait a second, I thought we were trying to insert a third term and there's already a third term. No, we want to make the third term. We don't want to do what they've already given us. Because technically, there should always be a number on this side too. And does 0 count? No. So we add 3 to both sides first. And then I have x squared minus x is equal to 3. Now I can start my process. What's that? What is b? Negative 1. So watch this. I've got x squared minus 1x. Anytime you do this, it's always going to be plus that third term. Now what's b? 1. We're not even going to worry about the sign. Okay? 1 divided by 2 squared equals 3 plus 1 divided by 2 squared. Can I do 1 divided by 2 and simplify it into a whole number? No, it's just 1/2. So what's 1/2 squared? One-fourth. Because you would do technically 1/2 times 1/2. 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4. That's where we get 1/4. Equals 3. And I'm going to make this a fraction because I'm going to need to add these numbers together. Now, do they have common denominators? No, so I'm going to have to get common denominators to add them. Plug it in your calculator. Let your calculator do the work for you, okay? Because what you would see here is that this would need to be 12 over 4 plus 1 over 4, which gives me what? 13 over 4. What is my sign going to be inside of my parentheses? Plus or minus? Minus. Because it's whatever this sign is in front of b. So I have minus. And then what is the square root of 1/4? 1/2. Okay? Now what would I do? Square root. Square root. Now, what does a square root over a fraction mean? It's the square root of the top and the square root of the bottom. So I've got x minus 1/2 is equal to, does 13 have an exact square root? No. But does 4 have an exact square root? Yes. So I could write that as a whole number. What's the sign that should go in front of it? Positive, negative. Now, am I going to set this into 2 different problems? No, because I still have a square root sign left in there. There is no square root of 13, so I can just write it as one problem. But what do I have to do before I can write the answer? Add 1/2, and I get x is equal to 1/2 plus or minus square root of 13 over 2. Now, this would be your answer, and this is totally fine if you want to write it like this. But did these have common denominators? So technically, if I wanted to, I could write it as one fraction. 1 plus or minus the square root of 13 over 2. Either one of those would be correct answers because they're the same thing. Okay? All right, let's do the last one on this example. X squared minus 8x plus 2. What am I going to have to do first? Subtract 2, because x squared plus bx has to be on one side by itself, or minus bx. So now I've got x squared minus 8x equals negative 2. How do I come up with that third term, Abby? So we do a divided by 2 and then square it. Whatever I do to one side, I've got to do to the other. So a divided by 2 is 4. 4 squared is 16. So now I have x squared minus 8x plus 16, negative 2 plus 16. Then I'm going to do the perfect square on this left side, and I'm going to get what? X minus 4. Perfect. I know it's got to be a minus because that's the sign in front of b, and the square root of 16 is 4. Negative 2 plus 16 is 14. Do our square root now. Does 14 have an exact square root? Can I simplify it? If I did upside down division, I would do 2 and then a 7. Do I have any pairs at all that I can take out? No. So the square root of 14 cannot be simplified, actually. It's just going to stay just like it is. But what's the sign that needs to go in front of it? Positive, negative? Now, do I need to separate this into two problems? No, because it doesn't have an exact answer. Okay, now if it was like x minus 4 equals positive, negative 6, yeah, then we can actually do some work and find out what x is equal to. But because it's not, I just add 4 to both sides and get x is equal to 4 plus or minus the square root of 14. And there's your final answer. Okay, that's how you do completing the square.